Israeli side in the middle of the shooting and the fighting and the what was going on there in 47, and showed them to a famous professor at the Hebrew University. That professor immediately bought half of what he had. The other half was bought by the Metropolitan on the east side. All of these are what are called Cave 1. Ultimately, all these materials ended up in what the Israelis call the Shrine of the Book, or the Museum of the Book, right near their Knesset or Parliament building in West Jerusalem. Now, as far as the public knew, that was all the scrolls. But that wasn't all of the scrolls. And the story of the purchase of the Metropolitan scrolls is a very interesting one, too, because after the war, this Syriac Metropolitan, who was called Father Athanasius...
And the term you're using, Metropolitan, is an Eastern Orthodox term which is the equivalent of bishop.
Basically, it's a high official in the church. I wouldn't want to say, I'm not expert on it, what it's equivalent to exactly, but probably relating something to bishop of that. It's a high official in the Eastern Orthodox Syriac church, okay. Right. He got to, after the fighting, he left Palestine, left Jerusalem, and ended up, of all places, in Hoboken, New Jersey. And there, the little church that he was head of ran out of money, and in the early 50s, he had to sell off his scrolls, which he had in a tin suitcase underneath his bed in Hoboken, New Jersey, the home of Frank Sinatra. And he put an advertisement, of all places, in the Wall Street Journal, scrolls for sale. Representatives of the Israeli authorities saw these, and under third persons, secret negotiations under third persons, because he probably wouldn't have sold these back to the Israelis had he known, and he said that he wouldn't have sold it to them had he known that the third parties represented them. They bought the scrolls for some enormous amount, whether a couple of $100,000 or $500,000, I don't know how much. By that time, they'd increased in value by that much. And that's how all the scrolls from Cave 1 got in the Israel Museum on the Israel side. All the scrolls that the Bedouin boy, we think, found, though there may be some others floating around out there, ended up in the Shrine of the Book, and the public thought, end story. But that wasn't the end of the story.
Now, my understanding is that where we get some controversy is that these first scrolls that were discovered were translated in a relatively quick amount of time.
That's right.
And yet, other scrolls that were discovered once the official establishment got control of the Dead Sea Scroll process, a little clique, a team, was appointed, and this team was the only scholars who were allowed to see the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only ones who actually knew what had been discovered, and were in charge of the translation process. And a process begins that goes on for years, where every now and then another scroll is translated and released to the public, usually the less controversial. My question for you is, can you describe for our viewers who exactly gained control of that process? In other words, who chose the team that got to have custody of the Dead Sea Scrolls? And am I correct that actually the Catholic Church had a lot to say, and was the point man some sort of Catholic priest?
Well, David, you just asked about 50 questions in one. So I'm going to go a little slower than you, because that's too complicated what you want me to answer in one question at the end. I'd like to tell you the rest of the story a bit. What happened was that though the public, the general public thought that what the Israelis were exhibiting, and they did translate these, and they didn't try to make political capital or academic capital out of them, pretty straightforwardly, the way things should be done, and open them up to general public viewing very early on in the early 50s. The public thought that was all of them. But what happened was other Bedouin teams began to look into other caves, and that's how we look at this field. There are 11 caves, and we designate the different scrolls by what caves they came from. 11 manuscript-bearing caves. And these came to light in the late 40s, early and mid-50s, some of them not till 55, 56. So we go up to Cave 11, and but by this time, the Arab-Israeli war had intervened, and so the partition of Palestine had occurred, and all the scrolls that were coming in after Cave 1, that is Cave 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, came in the East Jerusalem, or the Jordanian, by that time, occupied part of Palestine, actually the state of Jordan. So these scrolls went to East Jerusalem, to a place called the Rockefeller Museum. Now put yourself in a situation where the Jordanian government, ostensibly Muslim government, is getting Hebrew-written scrolls, and they are mostly in Hebrew, some Aramaic, a few Greek manuscripts, but mostly Hebrew manuscripts there, were coming in, and they are pretty authentic. They do date back to the time of Christ, whether 100 years before Christ or 100 years after Christ. Nobody is in agreement on the dating of these scrolls, and frankly, nobody likely ever will be on the precise dating. There's a fairly wide difference of opinion on that. But they certainly come from that period. And put yourself in the position of the Jordanian government. They didn't know what to do with these scrolls. Now, as it turned out, after the partition of Palestine, East Jerusalem was kind of a backwater. You couldn't get to the sea. You had to go all the way back to Amman and then fly over Lebanon even to get to East Jerusalem at that time, because the Israeli side and the Arab side were totally divided and weren't talking to it, and there was a no man to each other. There was a no man's land in between. The head of the Jordan society at that point was the same ruler we have today, King Hussein. But on the spot in East Jerusalem were a group of French prelates, mostly Dominican fathers, centered at a school called the École Biblique.
And for the benefit of the viewers, the Dominicans are an order of monks within the Catholic Church.
The Dominicans are an extremely conservative order of monks within the Catholic Church and have always been very orthodox and conservative doctrinally speaking. And the father who was in control of this École Biblique was the head of the Dominican order in Palestine, an individual named Father DeVoe. Now, you have a book on your table there, The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception, which actually covers this whole history in great detail. And I probably, much better than you and I could do it here, but that is the subject of that book by Bajan and Lee, which came out in the early 90s. I think it was actually published in 1992, if I'm not mistaken. So they do go through the whole discovery process and who was behind what and who controlled what. So to make a long story short, it became clear that the fathers, the religious-oriented fathers who had a direct line into more official circles in Rome, were looking very carefully at these materials. Now, their position is, to be fair, that they were trying to stop the crazies from getting involved. But whatever the reason for all this was, a kind of veil of secrecy fell down over the scrolls from around 1955 on. And the most important reason behind that was the discovery of a weird scroll called the Copper Scroll. The Copper Scroll was two pieces of scroll on copper plate. The reason for it was